Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Doyle, and by way of introduction, here's an image of me. I do deep learning, and I don't really know any neuroanatomy or anything, so if there's any clinicians in the room and you see anything, let me know. But yeah, I would like to give as gentle as possible an introduction to deep learning, and I think a lot of people skip over this because it is pretty easy to get started with deep learning without actually knowing any of the theory. And it turns out the theory is not that well understood by anyone. So here's what I understand of it. So here's the outline of my talk. First, we're going to get excited about deep learning and all the amazing things it can do. Then I'm going to introduce artificial neural networks. Explain the magical backpropagation algorithm that allows us to learn interesting models, and then explain how convolutional neural networks are a little different. So the current craze of deep learning that we're experiencing today is really because of the ImageNet 1000 competition, which is a computer vision challenge where there's millions and millions of little JPEG images of cats and dogs and JPEGs and toasters and airplanes, and you have to classify the 1,000 different categories using some automatic method. So the first deep learning entry into this challenge, which has been around for quite a while, improved the state-of-the-art by over 10% in a single year. And over 1,000 classes, this is really a remarkable improvement. And very rapidly after that, deep learning methods have surpassed human performance, and there are many who would claim that object recognition is solved. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with deep learning. Last year, I used this style transfer method to produce this image on the left, which is a slice of my brain in a color map in the style of my mother's artwork. And another team at the Brain Hack, which you should definitely consider attending next year, produced this vasculature image that they then submitted to the art competition. And these generative models can do lots of cross-modality stuff, like generate images from text. This bird is blue with white and has a short beak, is the input to this trained model. And in the left column, the bird looks pretty good. And if you refine it, it almost looks real. You can use these methods to do image-to-image mappings to kind of generate images of zebras, even though the classifier has never seen an image of a zebra running around. And this works to a certain extent in neuroimaging too. Although you have to be careful when you make up data. There's important work that has shown that you can learn a mapping from MRI to CT and even go the other way around and, based on a CT image, generate what an MRI would look like. All right, so now that everyone is as excited as I am, I'm going to get into the theory. So for deep learning, you need four things. You need the structure of an artificial neural network. You need a loss function. You need an optimizer, which is going to do the learning. And you need as much data as you can get your hands on. So for this talk, there's two types of neural networks. Neurons, I should say. There's feed-forward neurons, where you put some numeric value in, and it does some computation, and then produces an output. And there's recurrent neurons, which feed the output back into their input. And we're just going to deal with feed-forward for today. And so this is basically one version of one of these neurons. This particular one, X, we'll call it, has 3 different inputs, and it the neuron keeps track of weights that track how much it likes each of the inputs and a bias. And then at the output, it is just a linear combination of the weights times the inputs that each of the weights like, and with some nonlinearity f. And the nonlinearities that are used in deep learning, here are kind of the four common ones. On the top right is the rectified linear unit, which just passes through the input if it's positive and sets it to 0 if it's negative. But let's choose the sigmoid on the top left, which is nice because the derivative is super simple and makes the follow-up math a little easier. And because it's bounded between 0 and 1, we can pretend it's a probability. So now that we've chosen the sigmoid, we can write out the function that this little neuron computes. And it's just the sigmoid of this linear combination of inputs. And it turns out that this is a logistic regression classifier, the simplest classification machine learning algorithm you can learn. And here on the bottom right is a bunch of data. You've got two classes, red and blue, and this neuron will learn a straight line that separates the data optimally based on your training data set. But this is just one neuron. So if we then start to combine these neurons into a network, we can do much better than straight lines. So in this little, so when you create neural networks, you stack them in layers. And in each layer, the neurons are not connected to any of the other neurons in that particular layer. But in the fully connected or dense architecture, if you've heard of multi-layer perceptrons, that's dense or fully connected also. Each neuron is connected to every single neuron in the previous layer and the subsequent layer. So this little network has three layers. There's an input layer, and anything that's not directly visible to the input or output is called hidden, and we make a prediction at the output. So you could kind of imagine that this is a little bit like a support vector machine. And the hidden layers could conceivably learn some pairwise mapping between the data points you feed to it, and then after this pairwise mapping warps your space, you can draw a straight line through your data at the output with your logistic regression single neuron. And if you rearrange the neurons into a different architecture, now they're no longer neurons, they're nodes in a decision tree, where you put your data in at the top, and now each neuron applies some test to your data, and based on the test that you choose, you route the data left or right, and then depending on which leaf or node the data ends up, that's how you make your decision. And it turns out that you can represent these decision trees perfectly with a two hidden layer neural network. But let's say this classifier is not performing quite as well as you want it to. You want to add some more tests to your tree. So you add a bunch of nodes and make your tree deeper. This is still perfectly represented by a two-layer neural network, but we can always go deeper in deep learning. So if we go back to our little example here, these 5 neurons, because we chose the sigmoid nonlinearity, we can compute we can write out the function that at the output of each of these neurons. So x2 is pretty simple. It has one input, so it's just a weight times that input plus a bias with the nonlinearity. And if we go a little further, now this h2 neuron has 2 inputs, so it's the output of x1 times a weight, output of x2 times a weight plus a bias, nonlinearity. And we can expand this, and if we go all the way to the output, it's just the same thing over and over again. And so this is a lot of parameters in this little neural network, but the math is actually quite simple. And we end up with 17 parameters to learn. And this is the function that this little neural network is computing when you put data in. But we still need a way to learn the weights and biases to compute some useful function. And that's where the backpropagation algorithm comes in. And the backpropagation algorithm is actually quite simple. You basically just initialize your weights and biases randomly, and then you iterate between a forward pass, where you put all your data into the input, and you make predictions, and they start out as garbage predictions, and then you compute a loss function, which quantifies exactly how garbage those predictions are. And in the backwards pass, you use the derivative of your loss function with respect to all the weights to nudge the loss function in the direction that would make slightly less bad predictions. And you just iterate over and over again until you've got the least bad solution. So this little network, 2 inputs, 1 output, there's not like a whole lot of interesting functions that we could learn, but the XOR function has 2 inputs, 1 output. So you can interpret the rows of this little table as training examples. And you can feed them in and generate these y-hat predictions, which you could interpret as a probability of the real answer, O, and then calculate how wrong those are, because O is our ground truth, y-hat is our prediction. If we choose the mean squared error loss function, the square makes really wrong predictions count a lot more to if you sum over the entire training set than small errors. And then in the backwards pass, you take the gradient of this loss function with respect to all of the parameters of the network. Because this loss function j, y hat, was that long function that we had a few slides ago that depends on all of the weights and the biases. So this gradient, the triangle operator, with respect to all the parameters, is basically the direction that you have to update your weights in to make better predictions so that you minimize the loss function. So this is still hard to visualize, I think, for most people. So in the one-dimensional case, this is a little bit what it looks like. On the x-axis, we have a single weight, and on the y-axis is the loss function. And in backprop, we initialize our weight randomly, and so it ends up being chosen to be somewhere here. And then we put through all of our training data in an epoch of training, and end up with a computed value of the loss function. And we don't know what the shape of the loss function is, especially because most of the time we have millions and millions of parameters. But like imagining that this is the real shape of the loss function, how do we get to this global minimum, which is where our classifier does the best? So we take the derivative of the loss function with respect to this weight, and then that tells us which direction, if we have to add or subtract to the weight to make better predictions. And then this is where the optimizer comes in for the first time. And the optimizer uses this gradient to decide on a learning rule, to decide on W prime, the next value that we're going to try for the weight. And so this is the simplest possible learning rule, gradient descent, where you take a small fraction of the gradient, which we call the learning rate, and then we do another forward pass with this new weight. So we just iterate back and forth between this. We cross our fingers and hope the optimizer jumps over the local minimum, and then our network is trained and makes perfect predictions. So in the backwards pass, there's like an interesting visual interpretation back through the network where this the derivative of the loss function with respect to the weight on the H1 input is this chain rule thing, and if we use the sigmoid, it's actually pretty nice math, but the deeper we go, the more and more terms there are to compute, and we have to do this for every single weight and bias in the network. And in really deep networks, now we have several different paths through the network to get to the to capture the dependency. And this is like still a very simple problem. But luckily, TensorFlow and PyTorch do this for you. And if you want, you never have to see this math again. So there's an interesting hypothesis and an interesting way to think about this as your data living on a manifold. And in some simple two-dimensional case, let's say you had two classes of data that lived on this red curve and blue curve, and if we wanted to draw a straight line, we couldn't do that in this space to perfectly separate the data. And if you think of the layers of a neural network as feature extractors instead of just a giant classifier, this starts to make a lot of sense because in learning, you actually warp the space with your weights and biases until you get to a place on this manifold where it's very easy to draw a straight line at your output and separate your data. So convolutional neural networks are really where the current explosion of interest in deep learning comes from. And they're a little bit different from fully connected neurons. Because now a neuron in a convolutional layer is not connected to all of the neurons in the previous and subsequent layers. Now each neuron has a receptive field, kind of like the visual system in the brain. And this receptive field, though, so each neuron tracks like a little patch, and the weights can be interpreted as like a kind of filter that you could slide across the image in a convolution. And there's one copy of this neuron for every possible location that you could slide across. And that sounds like a lot of neurons, but it's really only one neuron because they're going to share the weights that they learn. So it's one filter, even though there's many, many different calculations being done. The fact that they share weights drastically reduces the number of parameters you have to learn. So this is kind of what it looks like in like a 2D MRI image. If you assumed enormous voxels, a 3x3 filter could learn some filter that maps to this convolutional layer, and it responds to the voxels that that's sliding over, and produces some activation which tracks like how much the weights times the input in this spatial configuration produce. And then you slide it across the image, and let's say that the brighter colors are higher activations, and you slide across the whole image and then produce this this input for the next layer. And there's another feature of convolutional neural network called max pooling, which helps to reduce the dimensionality of the problem. And this is especially useful when your input images are enormous brain images and not little 224 by 224 cats and dogs and toasters. So max pooling just takes the in an area, which is hard to see on this projector, but like a 2x2 area, and it just feeds forward the highest activation that exists in that 2x2 region. And you slide across the image in the same way, and you end up with a much smaller space for your next layer. So in the first slide, I showed you the ImageNet 1000 competition. So this is the structure of the artificial neural network that they used. And the input is on the left here, and this is a very common way of displaying convolutional neural networks that is a little bit difficult to unpack. But the inputs are these JPEGs of cats and dogs of 224 by 224 is the size of the image. And then they learn 11 by 11 filters. They add a stride of 4. So instead of sliding one voxel at a time, they slide 4, which reduces the size of the next layer. And then this is the convolutional layer. So there's 96 different filters being learned. And I showed you one in the MRI example I made. And this convolutional layer, the output after 11 by 11 patches strided is arranged spatially and preserves the spatial information that was in the original image, which is nice because a lot of the other methods, you're examining voxels independently unless you've done some feature extraction that pools information or something like that. So there's 5 convolutional layers here, but at the end of the convolutions, you still end up with this kind of square configuration, and you want to predict 1,000 classes at the end, and it's difficult to do that from a square. So you have to flatten into a long vector, and then there's 2 dense layers with lots of neurons, and then a final layer with 1,000 neurons in it, and each of the neurons likes one of the classes. So when it's trained, you can put data in, make predictions, and it'll give you a vector of probabilities, and the highest one is the winner. So the AlexNet paper used 2 different techniques that made this work really well, and I think this was the first paper to use GPUs to actually train. And it took a week, I think, to train, even with the 2 strongest GPUs that were available at the time. But this technique called dropout was used during training. So every time you put in some images, you randomly turn off half of the neurons in a layer. And what that does is it kind of forces the layer to learn different ways to predict the same thing. And this is really good to prevent overfitting. And when you have millions of parameters, it's really easy to learn to just memorize your training set and learn that the voxel in the top left corner is super associated to autism when maybe it's not because it's just empty space. But there's noise in all of our data sets that you can end up with these horrible solutions. So a lot of the work in deep learning is to prevent memorizing the training data set and making sure that your solution actually will generalize to data that's unseen. So the other technique is called batch normalization, which basically it's not very well understood how it works, but it's basically a whitening technique to make sure that the statistics, the activations of each batch are more or less the same, so you don't end up comparing apples to oranges batch after batch. So it's also worth noting that 90% of the parameters that were used in this classifier are in these dense layers. And that's really what makes convolutions so powerful, is it preserves the structure that we think is important. Neighboring voxels are importantly related. And if you stack enough of these convolutions, you end up being able to learn dependencies that are further apart. But you learn it in a much, much more efficient way. So because AlexNet used 11 by 11 patches, you can just plot the weights, and these are the weights that were found based on random initializations and end-to-end training of millions and millions of images over the course of weeks. And it's pretty remarkable that these edge detectors of different orientations and interfaces between colors are what emerge from the data and this simple backprop algorithm. So in neuroimaging, we have some differences between the people who do the cats and dogs and toasters and little 28 by 28 images of handwritten digits that everyone in deep learning reports their results on. Most of them are related to the data. So the quantity of data is almost never enough, and our huge data sets of hundreds of images are like not enough for most people in deep learning to really even be attracted to the problem. Because also the size and the dimensionality of each of the examples is enormous compared to the 28 by 28 pictures. The quality of the data is also either not great or unknown, and the quality of the labels is not great. You know, handwritten digits, it's pretty easy to determine what the ground truth is that you need for training supervised learning algorithms. But, you know, no offense to the clinicians, but they don't always make the right prediction. So with supervised learning, the best you can do is the best clinician's result, which we don't, you know, we haven't solved all the problems yet. So I think we need some more complex models to do some data-driven discovery that we'll hear about in a little bit. Also, the variability of data, like across scanners, you know, EEG systems with different numbers of channels and analog to digital converters, it makes it difficult to relate. And the unexpected pathology is a huge deal. You know, every once in a while there's an exciting paper. Deep learning will replace radiologists. Perfect classifier for tumor versus healthy control. But what happens when you put multiple sclerosis data into a tumor classifier? Will it predict healthy control or tumor? And like neither of those are meaningful in the context of MS. And basically all of the work that's done right now is healthy control versus disease. So we have to come up with a way of combining models. I don't know. There's a lot of challenges, but I think this is a really strong method that we're really just at the beginning of understanding. And if anyone has any data to share, let me know. And next up, we have Anisha Keshavan, who is going to give a hands-on tutorial of basically a convolutional neural network for real neuroimaging data. So if everyone wants to follow along, bring out your laptop, and there's a Jupyter notebook that she'll link to. And while she gets set up, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have. So thanks.